There are people who don't talk much about their past. Not because nothing happened, but because too much did. At some point, explaining it became heavier than carrying it. These are often the people others describe as strong, independent, or unshakable. They seem composed in chaos, calm under pressure, unaffected by things that overwhelm everyone else. But what's often missed is that this calm did not come from peace. It came from endurance. When a person goes through repeated emotional strain, not just one painful event, but years of pressure, disappointment, instability, or unmet needs, the mind begins to adapt, quietly, automatically, without asking for permission. This adaptation is not a conscious choice, it's survival. The human nervous system is designed to protect first, reflect later. And when stress becomes chronic, the system stops waiting for relief. It assumes the environment will not change, so it must. That's when personality starts to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but subtly over time. One of the first changes is emotional compression. Early on, emotions may still appear: sadness, anger, fear, hope. But when those emotions are repeatedly met with no resolution, no safety, or no support, the mind learns something important. Feeling fully is costly, so it begins to narrow the range. Joy becomes quieter, pain becomes flatter, reactions become delayed or muted. This is often mistaken for emotional coldness. In reality, it's emotional efficiency. When you've had to function through hardship, emotions stop being signals. They start feeling like obstacles. Another common shift is hyper-independence. People who have gone through too much often stop expecting help, not out of pride, but out of pattern recognition. They asked once, they waited, nothing changed. So they learned to rely on themselves even when it hurts. Over time, independence becomes identity. They don't just do things alone, they feel safer that way. Depending on others feels unpredictable. Vulnerability feels like exposure without protection. And yet, paradoxically, they may still long for connection. This creates an internal tension, wanting closeness but distrusting the cost of it. Then there is overthinking. Not the casual kind, but the kind that runs quietly in the background at all times. When someone has lived in emotionally unstable environments, the mind learns to scan ahead, to anticipate, to prepare. Overthinking is often mislabeled as anxiety, but at its core, it's pattern detection. The mind is trying to prevent future pain by replaying scenarios, examining tone changes, remembering past outcomes. It's not a lack of peace, it's a memory of consequences. Another adaptation is people-pleasing, though it doesn't always look obvious. Sometimes it shows up as being agreeable, other times as being overly self-aware, sometimes as shrinking one's needs to keep harmony. This behavior often forms when expressing needs once led to conflict, rejection, or emotional withdrawal. So the mind draws a conclusion: staying acceptable is safer than being authentic. Over time, this can lead to confusion about one's own preferences. When you've spent years adjusting to survive, it becomes hard to tell where adaptation ends and identity begins. Perhaps the most misunderstood change is emotional detachment. This isn't indifference, it's distance. Detachment forms when closeness repeatedly leads to pain. The mind doesn't stop caring, it just doesn't open fully. People who have gone through too much may still feel deeply, but they feel internally, privately, with control. They often observe more than they express. They listen more than they share. Not because they lack emotion, but because they learned that once emotion is released, it cannot always be taken back. What's important to understand is that none of these traits mean something is wrong with a person. They mean something happened for a long time. Chronic emotional stress doesn't just affect mood, it reshapes how the brain prioritizes safety, trust, and attention. Resilience in these cases does not look like optimism, it looks like endurance. There's also a quiet grief that often accompanies this psychology. Not always grief for a specific event, but grief for what could have been. The version of self that might have existed in a safer environment. The softness that was never fully allowed to develop. The ease that always felt postponed. This grief is rarely spoken aloud. It lives underneath competence. Interestingly, people who have gone through too much are often described as self-aware. They reflect deeply. They analyze their reactions. They notice patterns others miss. This awareness can be a strength, but it often developed as a necessity. When you couldn't control your environment, you learned to understand it. That understanding sometimes becomes over-responsibility, feeling accountable for outcomes that were never fully yours. Over time, the mind may begin to expect difficulty as the baseline. Calm feels unfamiliar. Peace feels temporary. Stability feels fragile. So even in safe moments, the nervous system may stay alert, waiting. This is not pessimism, it is conditioning. And yet, despite all of this, many people who have gone through too much still function, still succeed, still support others. This is why their internal world is often overlooked. Strength, when visible, invites assumption. Silence invites misunderstanding. But inside, there is often a constant negotiation between self-protection and the desire to feel fully alive again. Understanding this psychology is not about labeling people. It's about recognizing that some traits are not personality flaws. They are evidence. Evidence of adaptation. Evidence of persistence. Evidence of a nervous system that learned to survive before it learned to rest. When endurance becomes a way of life, it eventually comes with a cost. Not always immediately, often quietly. People who have gone through too much may function well for years, even decades, before realizing that survival has slowly replaced presence. They can do what needs to be done, but struggle to feel inside their own lives. Rest can feel uncomfortable. Stillness can feel unsafe. Joy can feel strangely distant. This is not because they don't deserve ease, but because their nervous system learned to stay alert for too long. Healing for these individuals rarely begins with forcing positivity or letting go. It begins with understanding that their responses once made sense, that their distance was protection, that their silence was intelligence. Only when the mind feels permission, not pressure, does it start to soften. And even then, healing doesn't look dramatic. It looks like small moments of safety, like choosing rest without guilt, like allowing emotion without immediately controlling it. For people who have gone through too much, recovery is not about becoming someone new. It's about finally meeting the self that had to stay hidden and letting that self exist without needing to endure anymore.